Grit is an ancient human attribute. I mean, it's been around forever, but it's been vaulted to the spotlight recently. And I think that's because of two social phenomenon that Martin and Bryce both kind of alluded to. This massive amount of disruption, change, uncertainty that we're all facing, being dealt with by an increasingly exhausted, at times distracted, overloaded workforce. So grit's really become this new holy grail. Forbes, I saw they recently wrote that what was a war for talent, this idea that recruiting and in-house training and whatnot was kind of competing to bring in talent, has now evolved into a war for grit. So there has to be a better solution, and I want to start looking for that with you up on the rivers of the Canadian Arctic. This is a place I've spent the last 23 consecutive summers guiding rafts and canoes. I stumbled into this landscape as a really young engineering graduate. I'd never been to the north before. I'd never rowed a raft before. I didn't mention that to the man who hired me. It did seem important. But this is if you haven't been to the Arctic, go, please. It's this extraordinary land, just incredible scale, like basically stunning, paralyzing beauty. It's the land of the midnight sun. It remains a last frontier. This was taken in Skagway, Alaska, and the next year I came back and he changed the sign and it said, "Warning, tree huggers can kiss my axe." So it's a tough place, and it is, a demanding, relentless, unforgiving land. It's wild. It remains relentlessly wild, and we're traveling through it on, really turbulent, rough rivers, about a degree or two above freezing. They've just melted from ice caps in the week or so before. And into this terrain, we're taking groups of new travelers to the Arctic. They're excited, they're nervous. We often have children, which is so awesome, but increasingly our clientele are senior citizens. So last year, the average age of our clientele over the entire summer was 72. Wow. So our average age has increased by 1 year every year for the 23 years I've worked there. So rafting's undergoing disruption. And I'm going to introduce you to one. So this is Marjorie. When I met her, she was 76. She landed in Whitehorse, come to a little room like this in a hotel for pre-trip briefing. Marjorie was from Switzerland. She was a bookkeeper. Her husband was a cobbler. They had been married 56 years and just led this perfectly prim and proper and organized life. Her husband had booked a trip. Marjorie was not thrilled, not impressed. In fact, for many months, she just refused to even consider going on this trip. And then her husband died. And so in that grief that followed, she decided she would come. And she would bring his ashes to spread them in this place that he'd dreamed of traveling. So she'd kind of stitched together this, gossamer of confidence and flown to the Arctic and landed. And I think that just started to shred as she got there, and she came to the pre-trip meeting, and afterwards she pulled me aside and she was like, "Bruce, I can't come. I'm not up. I can't do it. It's just too much." Basically, she's saying, "I don't have the grit it takes to do this." And what kind of seemed to have precipitated that deep emotion in her was a visit to the local mountain equipment co-op, and she'd bought for the trip what I think she assumed every good Canadian woman carries in her purse, which was a go-go girl. So this is a female urination funnel. And now she tearfully explained it didn't work. She tried it in her hotel room, and I was like, "You don't have to worry, because on the river we're going to bring a thing called a groover. It's like a rocket box, it's used army ammunition, and we pack out all our solid human waste." She didn't look impressed. So I then said, "Marjorie, I know you can do this. I know you have this in you. I really want you to come. I can't make you, but I will do everything I can to make this trip a success. I'll have you in my raft. I'll watch over you." And so she decided she would come, and we set off. And of course, it was incredible and beautiful and marvelous, as it always is in its own different way, until the 8th day. And we arrived at what might be my favorite place on the whole planet. I've been lucky to be a lot of places. This is the confluence of the Tatshenshini and the Alsek rivers. It's this huge open cathedral hidden right in the heart of the Alaska Coast Range Mountains. It's 100 square kilometers opening of, spawning salmon and gravel flats and bears. Look at the fireweed burning over here. This is the noisy range beyond us. We set up camp on the edge of the river, cooked dinner, so roast beef, Waldorf salad, mashed potatoes. If you guys have ever been on a rafting trip, guides are basically just like cooks who float down rivers. So it's getting worse. So the cinnamon buns were baking by the fire in the Dutch ovens when Marjorie got up and went to the groover. And she never came back. So this is where we were camped. This is a confluence seen from above. Here's our camp right here. And we set up the groover just down the shore, not far. You follow the edge of the river. We always put it down the edge of the river so you could just handrail to it. It was like 50 meters. Like it had to be out of sight from the kitchen. But, not that far. And so after about 3 or 4 minutes, my spidey sense started going. After about 5 minutes, I talked to a female co-guide. And she kind of surreptitiously went down the banks and looked, and she came back. She's like, Margie's not in the groover. So then we went right to her tent, unzipped it. She wasn't there. Unzipped every tent in camp. No sign of Margie. The only thing that we could find were her glasses sitting on her seat beside the fire. So obviously, critical situation, times of the essence. I didn't suspect at all an animal interaction, but I did worry she might have tumbled down that steep cut bank on the side of the river and ended up in that turbulent cold flow. And if she did, she's going to survive like a minute or two. So we launched a raft right away, no sign. We organized a hasty search. We organized a grid search, nothing. So this was in the age before satellite communication. We had no contact with the outside world. I had a orange rusty box called an HF radio that apparently bounced off the ionosphere. You might talk to a hunter in Pawlatuck, and if you could convince them, they might go and call the RCMP. We sent out a message and nothing came back, and we were still looking the next morning when I heard the sound of an approaching chopper. I landed in camp and knew the pilot. There's a very small community in the Yukon. Explained what had happened. We took off, got up to about 500, 800 feet, could see Margie within 3 minutes. She was alive. And quickly, we figured out what had happened. We picked her up. So she was in the groover, and when she came out without her eyeglasses, she saw this little creek and mistook it for this river and started following that through coastal brush on her hands and knees with her pants torn and dirt and grit and grime. And I'm like, Marjorie, you went 5 kilometers. I'm thinking the groover was 30 seconds from camp. Are you kidding me? She got to this lake after a couple hours and realized she was, and I've tried to do that hike myself. It is full on massive undertaking. Margie got to this lake and she's like, I'm lost. So she made a good decision. She's like, I'm going to stay put. There's some little offshore islands right there. She actually waded out to those. She thought, it's less likely that curious animals will come out and visit me. And she had a little Ziploc bag with some toilet paper and a lighter. And she managed to light a fire on that gravel beach. And then she collected spruce boughs from the trees that were around and built basically a little nest. And she got into that. And so that night that she spent alone in that primal wilderness had such an enormous impact on Marjorie. So it was so deeply moving for her. Not only did she not tap out, I thought, it's a big deal, spend a night out by yourself. I thought she'd want to go home with the chopper. She's like, oh no, I'm going to the end of the river. You are not sending me home. Okay, not only that, when Marjorie did go home, she returned to the Yukon every summer for the next 10 years, hired that helicopter pilot who flew her to that little island every summer and left her alone for a night so she could remember who she was and what she was capable of, and this thing that she had never glimpsed inside herself in those 76 years before.